The restaurant
You
was
look
warm and
absolutely
elegant,
radiant tonight.
filled
Thank
with
you, I
soft
feel so
music and
happy.
quiet
To the happy couple.
conversations. The
Cheers.
happy couple.
And then
Candlelight
the most
reflected off
incredible
the
thing
polished
happened.
glasses on
What
the
was it?
table.
The
Where
chef
Daniel
himself
and his
came out to
pregnant
explain
wife,
the dish.
Emily sat with a few of Daniel's business friends. It was supposed to be a simple dinner, celebration. After Daniel had signed a new business deal earlier that day, Daniel was in an unusually confident mood. He leaned back in his chair, smiling proudly as he talked about his growing company. His friends listened with interest. While occasionally praising his success, Emily sat quietly beside him, gently holding her glass of water, her other hand resting protectively on her growing belly. She was 7 months pregnant, and despite feeling tired, she wanted to support her husband at this important dinner. For years, Emily had stood beside Daniel through every struggle. When his company was small, when money was tight, and when many people doubted his ideas. But lately, something about Daniel had changed. Success had slowly turned his confidence into arrogance. As the conversation continued, one of Daniel's friends smiled and said, "You're lucky to have such a supportive wife, Daniel. Not everyone stays through the hard times like that." Daniel laughed lightly, swirling the drink in his glass. "Of course she stayed," he said casually. Emily looked at him, expecting him to say something kind. Instead, Daniel smirked and leaned back in his chair. "Let's be honest," he said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear. "She'd be nothing without me." The words landed heavily on the table. For a moment, the laughter and chatter around them faded. Daniel's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them coughed softly, unsure how to react. Emily felt her chest tighten. Her fingers slowly tightened around the glass she was holding. But she kept her expression calm. Inside, however, the words cut deeply, nothing without him. After everything she had sacrificed, after the nights she stayed awake helping him plan business strategies, after the time she comforted him when investors rejected him, she had never asked for credit. She had simply believed in him. And now in front of everyone, he had reduced her to nothing. Emily gently placed her glass on the table and took a quiet breath. Her hand moved again to her belly, feeling the soft movement of the baby inside. That small life gave her strength to stay silent. She refused to create a scene. Across the restaurant, at another table near the window, an older man in a dark suit slowly lowered his fork. He had heard every word, his expression remained calm. But his eyes had hardened slightly. Richard, Emily's father, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Daniel had always believed Emily came from a simple background. She had never corrected him, because she wanted their relationship to be about love, not money or status, but tonight, the truth had quietly witnessed everything. Richard watched his daughter for a moment as she sat silently at the table. Maintaining her dignity despite the humiliation, he saw the pain she was trying to hide. Richard placed his napkin on the table and stood up slowly. He didn't approach their table, not yet, but as he walked toward the restaurant exit, one quiet thought crossed his mind. Daniel had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and very soon he would understand exactly why. The next morning, Emily woke up early. The sunlight slowly filled the bedroom, but her mind was still heavy with the memory of the previous night. Daniel was already awake, busy on his phone, responding to messages from his business partners. He looked confident, almost proud of himself, as if nothing unusual had happened. Emily quietly walked to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea. Her hand gently rested on her belly. As she waited for the kettle to boil, the baby moved slightly and she smiled faintly. That small life inside her reminded her that she had to stay strong. Just as she sat down at the kitchen table, her phone rang. She looked at the screen and froze for a second. It was her father. Emily hesitated before answering. She already had a feeling why he was calling. "Hello, Dad," she said softly on the other side of the phone. Richard's voice was calm but serious. "Good morning, Emily. Are you feeling okay?" Emily forced a small smile, even though he couldn't see it. "Yes, I'm fine." There was a short silence. Then Richard spoke again. "I was at the restaurant last night." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She closed her eyes for a moment, realizing that her father had heard everything Daniel said. "I didn't want to interrupt your evening." Richard continued calmly, "But I heard what your husband said." Emily tried to defend Daniel. Even though the words still hurt, he didn't mean it like that, she said quietly. He was just joking with his friends. But Richard knew his daughter too well. He could hear the pain hidden behind her calm voice. "Emily," he said gently, "a man's real character shows in the way he speaks about the person who stands beside him. Emily remained silent. She had always believed Daniel loved her. She had supported him through every struggle. When his business was small and uncertain, she remembered the nights when they both worried about bills, when she encouraged him not to give up. Back then, Daniel had been humble, but success had slowly changed him. Richard sighed softly on the phone. "I built my entire business from nothing," he said, "and I've learned one important lesson in life. Arrogance is the fastest way for a man to destroy himself." Emily didn't respond. She simply listened. Richard's voice became firm but calm. "I'm not going to argue with him. I'm not going to threaten him either." Emily frowned slightly, unsure what her father meant. "Then what will you do?" she asked quietly. Richard paused for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "life teaches people better lessons than words." Emily didn't fully understand his plan, but she knew her father well, enough to realize he had already made a decision. Meanwhile, in the living room, Daniel was excitedly talking on the phone with one of his investors, but his confident tone slowly began to change. "What do you mean you're pulling out?" Daniel said, suddenly standing up. Emily could hear the frustration in his voice. From the kitchen, this deal was already finalized. A few minutes later, Daniel ended the call angrily. Before he could calm down, his phone rang again and again. Each call brought worse news. Another investor was stepping away. A major partnership was suddenly delayed. A supplier had canceled an agreement without explanation within a single morning. Daniel's perfectly stable business world had started to shake. Confused and stressed, he ran a hand through his hair. "This makes no sense," he muttered in the kitchen. Emily slowly lowered her phone after ending the call with her father. She didn't say anything, but deep inside, she had a quiet feeling that Daniel's world was only beginning to change over the next few weeks. Daniel's life began to unravel faster than he could control. Every morning he woke up, hoping the problems with his company would somehow fix themselves. But instead of good news, each day only brought more trouble. Investors who once trusted him suddenly stopped answering his calls. Important meetings were canceled without clear explanations. Suppliers who had worked with him for years started delaying deliveries or increasing prices. Daniel sat in his office late one night, staring at the numbers on his computer screen. His company had lost nearly half of its funding in just 3 weeks. "This can't be happening," he whispered to himself. Just a month ago, everything had been perfect. His company was growing. His reputation was strong, and people admired his success. Now it felt like the entire business world had suddenly turned against him. At home, Emily noticed the change in him. Daniel was no longer confident and loud like before. The man who once bragged about his success now walked around the house in silence, constantly checking his phone and worrying about the next problem. Despite everything that had happened at the dinner, Emily still cared about him. She never wished for his failure, but she also couldn't forget the humiliation she felt when he said she was nothing without him. One evening, Daniel came home looking completely exhausted. His tie was loose and his face showed deep stress. He sat heavily on the couch and buried his face in his hands. Emily slowly walked into the living room and sat across from him. "Daniel," she said gently, "what's happening with the company?" He looked up at her, frustration clear in his eyes. "I don't understand it," he said. "Investors are leaving, deals are collapsing, and no one will explain why." Emily listened quietly for the first time in a long time. Daniel looked vulnerable. "I worked so hard for this," he continued. "Everything I built is falling apart." Emily took a slow breath. She wanted to comfort him. But something inside her had changed. She had spent years supporting him without ever demanding respect. Now she simply observed him calmly. A few days later, things became even worse. Daniel's main bank refused to extend a loan that his company desperately needed. Without that money, his business would barely survive another month. Desperate, Daniel finally turned to the one person he had ignored for too long. Emily. That night, he approached her in the kitchen while she was preparing dinner. "Emily," he said quietly, "I need your support right now." She turned to look at him. "You always believed in me," he continued. "You know I can fix this if I just get one more chance." Emily studied his face carefully. The arrogance that once filled his voice was gone. Now there was only fear and regret. At that moment, the sound of a car stopped outside the house. Daniel frowned slightly and walked toward the window. A long black luxury car had just pulled into their driveway. A few seconds later, the front doorbell rang. Emily already knew who it was. Daniel opened the door and froze in surprise when he saw a tall, older man standing calmly outside in a perfectly tailored suit. The man stepped inside with quiet confidence. Daniel looked confused. "Can I help you?" The man's sharp eyes briefly glanced at Emily. Before returning to Daniel, then he spoke in a calm, steady voice. "My name is Richard." There was a short pause. "I'm Emily's father." The room fell into complete silence after the man's words. Daniel stood frozen near the door, trying to process what he had just heard. "Emily's father?" he repeated slowly. He looked back at his wife in confusion. Emily stood calmly near the kitchen counter, her expression quiet but steady. She had never hidden her father intentionally. She had simply never felt the need to talk about his wealth. Daniel stepped aside as Richard calmly walked into the living room. The older man carried himself with quiet authority. His presence alone filled the room with a kind of pressure Daniel had never felt before. Richard looked around the house briefly, before turning his attention back to Daniel. "I believe we should talk," he said. They all sat down in the living room. Daniel's mind was racing. Something about this situation felt deeply unsettling. Finally, Daniel asked, "Why didn't Emily ever tell me about you?" Emily answered calmly, "Because I wanted you to love me for who I am. Not for my family." Daniel had no response. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "I heard what you said to my daughter at the restaurant," he said. Daniel's face slowly turned pale. He immediately remembered the dinner, the laughter, and the careless words he had spoken. "She'd be nothing without me." The sentence now echoed painfully in his mind. I didn't mean it like that," Daniel said quickly. "It was just a joke." Richard didn't react emotionally. His voice remained calm and controlled. A man's jokes often reveal his real thoughts. Daniel looked down at the floor, unable to argue for the first time in his life. He felt truly ashamed. Richard continued speaking. "Emily supported you when your business had nothing. He said she stood beside you when others doubted you." Emily remained silent, letting her father speak. "But success changed you," Richard said. "Instead of respecting the person who helped you rise, you chose to humiliate her." Daniel swallowed nervously. Then Richard said something that made Daniel's heart sink. "The investors who left your company, the partnerships that suddenly disappeared, the bank that refused your loan." Daniel slowly looked up. Richard's eyes were calm but firm. "That was my decision." The realization hit Daniel like a heavy weight. Everything that had gone wrong in his business suddenly made sense. Richard wasn't shouting or threatening him, but the quiet power behind his words was far more terrifying. "I wanted you to experience what arrogance costs." Richard continued. Daniel's voice trembled slightly. "You destroyed my company." Richard shook his head slowly. "No," he replied calmly. "Your arrogance destroyed it. I simply removed the protection you never knew you had." Daniel sat in stunned silence. After a moment, he turned toward Emily. His voice was filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "I was wrong. I took you for granted." Emily looked at him quietly. For years, she had supported him, believed in him, and defended him. But something inside her head changed. After that night at the restaurant, she stood up slowly. "Respect cannot be forced after it's broken," she said gently. Richard also stood. Then he turned to his daughter. "You don't have to stay where you're not valued," he told her a few months later. Emily accepted her father's offer to help lead one of his companies. She built her own success, earned respect, and prepared to welcome her baby into a life filled with dignity. Daniel watched from a distance, realizing too late that his greatest loss wasn't his company. It was the woman who once believed in him when no one else did.